The night promised to be unforgettable. After weeks of swiping left and right on my phone screen, I finally found someone who seemed to share not only my interests but also my passion for horror movies. Anderson was charming in his messages, and his suggestion of watching a horror classic at his place seemed perfect. "The best way to get to know someone is in a comfortable environment," he wrote, and I, driven by a mix of excitement and that typical adrenaline of a first date, agreed. Arriving at Anderson's house, I was greeted by a cozy living room, with soft lights and a large comfortable couch that seemed perfect for long hours of movies. On the walls, posters of classic and contemporary horror movies, a true sanctuary for any genre fan. Anderson had prepared popcorn and sodas, and his friendly manner instantly made me feel at ease. Everything seemed so normal, so perfect. It was hard to imagine that the night could take such a terribly wrong turn. As the movie reached its tensest moments, I began to hear strange noises coming from the hallway leading to other parts of the house. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, fueled by the suspenseful scenes on the screen. However, the sounds persisted, a mixture of scratching and whispers that seemed to intensify as the movie progressed. Anderson seemed not to notice, completely absorbed in the film. "Are you hearing that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He gave me a quick glance, smiling slightly before returning his attention to the movie. "It's just the house," he said dismissively. "Sometimes it makes those noises, especially at night. Don't worry, we're alone here." But the way he said it, so quickly and without really checking, made me even more nervous. I looked at him after a few minutes, still completely immersed in the movie, and murmured, "I'm going to the bathroom. Be right back." He nodded, not taking his eyes off the screen, and I continued my charade as I walked towards the corridor that supposedly led to the bathroom. However, instead, I followed the sound, which became clearer and more disturbing with every step. My heart was pounding, echoing in my ears almost as loud as the noises guiding me. The sounds led me to a slightly open door at the end of the hallway. It was a small laundry room, poorly lit and filled with shadows. There, hidden behind a pile of dirty clothes, I found a small digital camera pointing towards the corridor leading back to the living room. The discovery was like a punch to the gut, making my blood run cold. Why would Anderson have a hidden camera here? I asked myself. With the discovery of the camera, my instinct to flee intensified. However, I knew I needed to confront Anderson, not only to understand his intentions but also to ensure my own safety. I took a deep breath and returned to the living room, trying to maintain a neutral expression while thousands of thoughts haunted me. Anderson was still there, absorbed in the movie, smiling when I returned. "Everything okay?" he asked casually, as if nothing was wrong. That simplicity gave me chills. "Why do you have a hidden camera in the laundry room?" My voice trembled, but I managed to hold firm. The change in atmosphere was immediate. His smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of coldness that I hadn't seen before. "Anderson, why?" I insisted, my heart pounding so hard that it almost choked my words. He sighed, running his hand through his hair before responding with disturbing calmness. "I filmed all of our movie sessions. Something I like to do. It's nothing personal against you." Fear mixed with anger. "Without my consent? That's not right, Anderson. That's illegal." He stood up, his imposing stature suddenly seeming threatening. "You're overreacting. Come on. Sit down and let's finish the movie." But I knew I couldn't stay. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of that house as fast as possible. "I can't stay here," I said, stepping back towards the door. The tension between us was a mixture of fear, betrayal, and a growing understanding of Anderson's true intentions. I needed a plan, something to get me out of this situation without escalating to something worse. Okay, let's finish the movie. But first, let me get some juice in the kitchen, I said, trying to sound as calm as possible. He relaxed a bit, still suspicious, but nodded. Quickly, then, as soon as I turned my back on him, I ran. Not to the kitchen, but to the front door. I pulled the handle with all the force I had, but it was locked. Absolute terror took hold of me as I heard his footsteps approaching quickly from behind. "What are you doing?" His voice was low but filled with anger. Desperate. I looked around and saw my keys and phone on a small table next to the door. I ran to them, grabbed my phone, and unlocked the door with the keys. "This is madness. You can't just film people without consent," I shouted as I opened the door. I ran out, without looking back, hearing Anderson shouting my name from the door. I ran through the dark streets, my heart still pounding uncontrollably. Finally, I stopped, panting, under a streetlight a few blocks away, and called the police. After the police arrived, I told them all the details of what had happened, from the Tinder date to the disturbing discovery of the cameras. They listened carefully and promised to investigate the situation. Anderson was taken in for questioning, and as I watched him being questioned by the police, I felt a mix of relief and disbelief. How could something that started with so much promise turn into a nightmare so quickly? It was a harsh but vital lesson. Reality, sometimes, can be scarier than any horror movie. My story begins on a typical sunny summer day. I, Annie, newly arrived in the big city, was determined to expand my social circle and experience everything the new environment had to offer. With a mix of anticipation and anxiety, I turned to Tinder, hoping to find someone with whom I could explore the city and perhaps, who knows, build a new friendship or something more. That's when I met Noah. He had a charming smile and a gaze that conveyed kindness. Our conversation flowed naturally, and soon we were making plans to meet up for a hike on a local trail famous for its spectacular sunset views. It seemed like the perfect plan for a date. Nature, conversation, and a beautiful landscape. What better way was there to get to know someone? On the appointed day, we met at a bustling coffee shop in the heart of the city. Noah was even more charming in person, and I was excited about the prospect of spending the afternoon with him. As we headed towards the trail, Noah told fascinating stories about the city and his love for the outdoors. I felt increasingly comfortable, enveloped by his charismatic presence and the beauty of the path we were walking. However, as the sun began to set, Noah suggested we take a lesser-known path, promising even more impressive views. The trail became more secluded, and the markings less frequent. A subtle unease began to bother me. It was then that I realized, with a pang of alarm, that I didn't exactly know where we were. As daylight dwindled and the shadows of night began to form, Noah became increasingly insistent on following even more remote paths. The discomfort I felt grew, turning into pure anxiety. The friendly conversation that had flowed so naturally before now gave way to tense silence, punctuated only by Noah's occasional comments about how lucky we were to be there, far from everything and everyone. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that maybe I was just being paranoid. However, intuition, that inner voice that we so often choose to ignore, screamed at me to stay alert. Noah began to show a side that I hadn't seen in messages or at the coffee shop. A possessive and aggressive tone emerged as he insisted that we not go back the same way, even when I mentioned that I was starting to feel uncomfortable. When I finally suggested that we should turn back, Noah grabbed my arm tightly, looking at me with an intensity that made me freeze. "We're not ready to leave yet," he said, his voice low and controlling. I felt like prey in the sights of a predator, and my body screamed for escape. At that moment, my mind started racing, frantically evaluating escape possibilities. I knew I needed to act quickly and intelligently if I wanted to get out of there. The trail was dark, and every sound seemed amplified by the fear consuming me. In an act of desperation and courage, I pretended to accept the situation, relaxing my body and engaging Noah in conversation to distract him. I asked about other trails he knew, giving him the impression that I might be interested. He loosened his grip a bit, and that's when I saw my chance. With a quick movement, I managed to break free and began to run in what I remembered to be the direction of the trail entrance. Noah shouted my name, his voice full of anger and surprise. The sound of his footsteps behind me was terrible, like the beating of a panicked heart. I ran desperately, stumbling over roots and rocks, every sound of the nocturnal forest making me jump in fear. The darkness was almost total, and I could barely see where I was stepping. Suddenly, I heard a loud noise to my left and stopped abruptly. A figure passed by me, disappearing into the vegetation. My heart stopped for a second. Was it Noah trying to cut me off? I hid behind a thick tree, holding my breath, trying to hear any sound that might indicate his position. After what seemed like an eternity, I decided to move again, calculating every step to avoid branches that could reveal my position. Finally, after a harrowing run, I saw the lights of a car on the road in the distance. I ran like never before, emerging from the trail with burning lungs and screaming muscles. I had never been so relieved to see a group of people who, luckily, were passing by the road at that moment. I quickly explained my situation, and they helped me contact the police. After the rescue, as the police took my statement and I tried to catch my breath and calm my still racing heart, the consequences of that night began to become clearer in my mind. Fear and adrenaline gave way to a wave of relief, but also to a persistent feeling of vulnerability and mistrust. In the days that followed, Noah was located and arrested thanks to the information I provided and the quick action of the authorities. I found out that it wasn't the first time he had tried something like that, which made me even more grateful to have escaped. That experience changed the way I interact with new people and especially how I use dating apps. I became more cautious, always informing friends or family about my plans and never deviating to isolated places with someone I barely knew. I never imagined that my attempt to move on after a 5-year relationship would lead me down such a sinister path. It was a friend who suggested I should try using Tinder to meet new people. It's fun, you'll see, and who knows, maybe you'll meet someone interesting, he encouraged me. Reluctantly, I created my profile, swiping left and right until one day, the profile of a man named Lucas caught my attention. He seemed charming, had a captivating smile, and enjoyed many things that I also appreciated: mystery books, outdoor hikes, and jazz. Our initial conversations were light and enjoyable. Lucas had a way of writing that made me feel like we had known each other for years. For weeks, we exchanged messages about everything, from our favorite movies to the dreams we hoped to one day achieve. Finally, we agreed to meet in person. I was excited, but a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that I should be cautious. Ignoring it, I decided that our first date would be at a local coffee shop I frequented, a public and safe place, I thought. The meeting initially went well, but it didn't take long for Lucas to suggest a change of scenery to a bar he said was cozier and more intimate, located in a more secluded part of the city. Despite my reluctance, I agreed. After all, he had been so pleasant thus far. However, when we arrived, the bar was darker and emptier than I expected. The initial discomfort I felt at the coffee shop began to grow, but I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. As the night progressed, Lucas' behavior began to change. The initial charm gave way to a more coercive and intrusive demeanor. He started asking increasingly personal questions, inquiring about my past relationships, details of my daily routine that left me uncomfortable. His insistence on knowing who I lived with or how often I went out alone per week seemed out of the ordinary. With each question, a twinge of alarm sounded louder within me. I tried to change the subject, but Lucas always found a way to bring the focus back to personal topics. He smiled, but there was something in his smile that now seemed forced, almost predatory. When he suggested, for the third time, that we should go to an even more private place, claiming he wanted to truly get to know me without interruptions, I knew I had to act. Each suggestion was accompanied by an intense look that seemed to try to convince me, or rather, coerce me into accepting. The secluded bar and the growing discomfort made me realize that the situation was heading towards something potentially dangerous. The background music, once just a noise, now seemed deafening, intensifying my anxiety. My phone, which normally rested quietly on the table, became my lifeline. I sent a discreet message to a friend, asking her to call me with a fake emergency. I was just hoping for a chance to escape from that encounter that had turned into a game of manipulation and pressure. My friend didn't take long to respond. The phone vibrated, and I quickly answered, mentally thanking her for being on the other end of the line. With my best acting skills, I expressed panic as she told me she urgently needed me. Lucas watched, his gaze hardening as the conversation progressed. "I have to go. An emergency with a friend," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can't you stay a little longer?" Lucas insisted, holding my arm tighter than necessary when I tried to get up. His touch burned my skin, and every cell in my body screamed for me to get out of there. "I really need to go," I insisted, pulling my arm back with an effort I didn't expect to have to make. He finally let go, but his look didn't hide the frustration. "Make sure to text me when you get home," he said, with a tone that didn't sound like mere concern, but like a demand to maintain some control over me. Quickly, I grabbed my things, avoiding his piercing gaze, and ran out of the bar. As I walked away, the cold of the night was nothing compared to the ice forming in my spine. The sound of my footsteps seemed to echo through the empty streets. Every distant car headlight made me turn to check if Lucas had decided to follow me. I only managed to relax when I got into a taxi, feeling a mix of relief and terror at realizing how dangerous that night could have become. After that night, I blocked Lucas on all social media and on Tinder itself. Despite the relief of having escaped without further harm, the experience left a deep mark on me. I spent weeks reliving every moment of the encounter, wondering what could have happened if I hadn't had the chance to escape. I learned to value even more the importance of listening to my intuition and keeping initial dates always in public and busy places. It was an apparently normal Friday night when I decided that perhaps it was time to try something new, something exciting. My friends had been filling me with stories about their Tinder dates for some time, so why not give it a chance? After all, what did I have to lose? Swiping through profiles, I came across him, Joel. His profile was captivating, filled with smiling photos from trips around the world and descriptions of someone passionate about adventures and good food. It didn't take long for him to give me a super like and start a conversation that flowed incredibly naturally and engagingly. He had a charming way about him and an eloquence that few possess, and within a few hours of chatting, he invited me to dinner. Why not? I thought. He suggested his place, saying he loved to cook and that it would be more intimate and comfortable. The proposal sounded tempting, and despite a slight initial hesitation, excitement outweighed apprehension. We arranged to meet the next evening. I couldn't imagine that this decision would lead me to one of the most terrifying nights of my life. As I prepared for the date, a mixture of anxiety and excitement consumed me. Joel had sent his address, and as I entered it into the GPS, I noticed that his house was in a more remote area of the city, a region I wasn't familiar with. The path became progressively lonelier and darker as I moved away from the urban center. Spaced out houses between large plots of land and little public lighting. Uncomfortable feeling began to settle in the pit of my stomach, but I tried to ignore it, attributing it to first date nerves. Upon arrival, I was surprised to find a large and somewhat antiquated house, with tall windows and a poorly kept garden. The lighting was scarce, both outside and inside the residence. Joel greeted me with a warm smile and a hug that, although gentle, lasted a bit longer than expected. He led me inside, and as we walked through the corridors to the dining room, the old-fashioned decor and walls adorned with dark paintings gave the place an air of mystery and desolation. Dinner started pleasantly, with conversations about trivialities and lots of laughter. However, as I got distracted by the tasty dish he had prepared, Joel abruptly changed the topic of conversation to our daily routines. He began to describe in alarming detail places I frequented, mentioning seeing me several times in situations we had never discussed before. His voice carried a tone of pride as he revealed each observation, as if it were a game that he was clearly winning. Feeling a chill run through my body, I asked how he knew so much about me. It was then that he got up, went to a cupboard, and pulled out several photos. Photos of me taken from afar on different days and situations. Some in places I frequented alone, clearly without my knowledge or consent. His explanation was simple and terrifying. I wanted to make sure you were really who you said you were, and, well, I got a little carried away. As Joel placed the photos on the table, every muscle in my body tensed in alarm. My mind raced trying to process the revelation that he had been following me for weeks. The realization that the man in front of me was not who he seemed to be, and that I might not easily leave there began to become a frightening reality. I tried to stay calm and think of a way out. Joel, I really need to go now. It's getting late and I tried to say as casually as possible. However, he didn't seem willing to let me go. With a quick movement, he got up and locked the dining room door, putting the key in his pants pocket. I think you can stay a little longer. We haven't finished our dinner, and I prepared a special dessert for us, he said, with a smile that didn't seem genuine. The reality of my situation began to sink in, and fear turned into panic. As he turned to fetch something in the kitchen, I quickly searched the room for something I could use to defend myself or another way out. The only window in the room was locked with heavy curtains and bars. My heart was beating so hard that I could hear its echo in the silent room. When Joel returned, he brought 2 glasses and a bottle of wine. "A toast to our night," he said, filling the glasses. I refused to drink, which made him frown disapprovingly. Realizing that my refusal only annoyed him, I picked up the glass, pretending to smile. As soon as he was distracted to pour his own glass, I saw my chance. With a trembling hand, I threw the glass against the wall behind him and ran towards the door. Joel shouted in surprise and anger, launching himself after me. I stumbled over a chair, which delayed me enough for him to catch up to me, grabbing my arm tightly. Fighting with all my strength, I managed to break free and continued running towards the entrance. My only hope was that the front door was unlocked. With Joel still on my heels, I reached the front door and, by stroke of luck, it was unlocked. I threw myself outside, shouting for help with all the strength of my lungs, as I ran down the dark path leading to the street. The cool night air never seemed so welcoming. Once on the street, I ran without looking back, guided only by the instinct of survival. My screams finally attracted the attention of a neighbor, who, upon seeing my state of despair, didn't hesitate to call the police. As the sirens echoed in the distance, I could finally allow relief to replace fear, if only momentarily. The police arrived quickly, and with them came safety. Joel was detained that same night. During the investigation, it was discovered that I was not the first to be lured into that scenario under false pretenses. The house held dark stories, and Joel a history of disturbing behaviors that only then came to light. I share my story now not only as a vent, but as a warning so that others may recognize and avoid similar traps. Life is precious, and sometimes a simple no can be the most powerful gesture of self-preservation we can offer ourselves. On that Friday night, I was buzzing with excitement. As a young designer newly arrived in the big city, opportunities to create new social and professional connections were something I didn't want to miss out on. So when I met Jones on Tinder and he revealed himself to be a photographer, I thought it could be a promising collaboration, along with the chance that maybe something more personal might emerge. Jones invited me to a photo shoot at a local studio that he said he was using for an artistic project. It's going to be something unique, a true dive into the essence of human emotion, he wrote. The invitation had a touch of mystery and charm that immediately drew me in. However, as I got ready for the date, a slight anxiety bubbled in my stomach, a feeling I chose to ignore, attributing it to the nerves of a new encounter. Upon arriving at the studio, I was impressed with the environment at first. The walls were decorated with various photos of urban landscapes and expressive portraits that captured the complexity of human emotions. The space was large, with several lights and cameras set up, creating a professional and artistic aura. Jones greeted me with a warm smile and a firm handshake. For a moment, I felt relieved and excited about the prospect of a night of creativity and perhaps a little romance. However, as Jones guided me through the studio, my gaze was inevitably drawn to a series of somewhat disturbing photographs that I hadn't noticed initially. They were portraits of women, but unlike the other lively images, these seemed grim, with the models displaying expressions of fear and sadness. I began to feel a subtle but pervasive sense of discomfort. When I questioned Jones about the unsettling photos, his explanation was vague and rehearsed, something he called an exploration of human shadows through the lens. He encouraged me not to worry, saying it was all part of his artistic style. But as time passed, the relaxed and inspiring atmosphere I had felt upon entering began to dissolve, replaced by tension. Jones began to prepare me for the shoot, guiding me with a tone that gradually lost its cordiality and acquired a rigid authority. He seemed particularly fixated on capturing expressions of vulnerability and fear, which he described as the true essence of beauty. With each click of the camera, I felt less like a participant and more like an object in his disturbing scene. It was then that he made a revelation that chilled my blood. As he changed the camera lens with a casualness that was completely out of context, he remarked, many of the women I photographed before never really understood my vision. They never cooperated as I wanted. His gaze hardened, and he added, I hope you don't disappoint me. My fear began to escalate rapidly, turning the initial anxiety into genuine terror. My heart was pounding, and I was already very much wanting to get out of there. I knew I had to keep calm to think of a way out. Every step I took in the studio now was measured. I was thinking of a way to escape. I was alone with a man who clearly had ill intentions, in a studio that had transformed from a space of art into a sinister trap. The urgency to escape became the only thing I could think about. The tension reached its peak when Jones asked me to pose in a way that made me feel extremely vulnerable. His voice was impatient, and there was a strange gleam in his eyes that deeply frightened me. It was at that moment that I noticed the camera tripod beside me, a heavy, metallic tool. The idea of using it as a weapon came like a lightning bolt, a desperate but necessary thought for my survival. As Jones approached closer than was comfortable, under the pretext of adjusting the position of the light. I knew it was my chance. With a quick movement and all the strength I could muster, I grabbed the tripod and swung it with force at him. The impact caught him off guard, causing him to stumble backwards, crashing into one of the light stands, which fell with a deafening crash. Seizing his momentary disorientation, I ran for the door. My footsteps echoed through the studio like drums, marking every second of my desperate escape. My heart was beating so loudly that I could swear he heard it, even with the distance I was putting between us. For a brief, horrible moment, I thought the door would be locked, but with a push, it swung open quickly. After the terror of that night, the police launched a search for Jones, but he had disappeared without a trace. The studio, as it seemed, was just a temporarily rented space, and there weren't many clues leading to his real location. The following weeks were a whirlwind of police statements, sleepless nights, and a constant feeling of looking over my shoulder. The idea that Jones could still be out there, free, was a thought that sent shivers down my spine. I decided to take a break from dating apps. It was a period of introspection and recovery, where I had to reconnect with my own safety and well-being. That night, after yet another lonely dinner in front of the TV, I decided I needed something to shake up the monotony of my days. That's when, on a whim, I downloaded Tinder and started swiping through profiles. Amid blurry photos and generic bios, Elliot's profile stood out. Charming, enigmatic, with a smile that seemed to hold fascinating secrets. We chatted for days, and he always had something interesting to say. He talked about literature, music, and his travels around the world. It was as if he knew exactly what to say to captivate me. The decision to explore something new with someone unknown was exciting, almost an adventure. Elliot suggested we meet for a night hike on a trail he described as a hidden gem of the city. Something about his proposal sounded incredibly alluring. The mystery, the adventure, the promise of something extraordinary. As the date of our meeting approached, however, I noticed details that began to sow doubt in my mind. Elliot mentioned aspects of my life, small things I had never shared in our conversations or on my profile. When questioned, he would deflect, always steering the conversation towards some fascinating topic that made me forget my concerns. That's when I decided to suggest a video call, telling myself it was just to calm my nerves. On the screen, the Elliot I saw wasn't exactly the one from the photos. His face was the same, but there was something unsettling in his eyes, and the way his answers seemed rehearsed, as if he were trying to remember a script. During that video call, the conversation took an even stranger and more uncomfortable turn. Elliot started talking about things he believed could improve in my life. These weren't harmless suggestions but pointed comments about my habits and choices, as if he had studied me. The way he spoke, with a cold and calculated certainty, made me feel like I had been under observation for a long time. He mentioned the color of my bedroom curtains and my morning running routine, details I had never mentioned. I tried to stay calm and asked how he knew these things. Elliot just smiled, a fake smile, and said he liked to pay attention to details because it was part of caring about someone. The way he twisted the situation, trying to justify his invasive behavior as an act of care, only heightened my unease. I decided to end the call, citing tiredness, but my mind was racing. The night hike proposal, which had once seemed like an adventure, now sounded like a horror movie scenario where everything could go wrong. The conversation with Elliot had revealed a side of him that I couldn't ignore. Every word and every revelation made me question not only who he really was, but also the danger I might be in if I proceeded with the planned meeting. After ending the video call, I tried to convince myself that maybe I was overreacting, that anxiety was making me see threats where there were none. But an inner voice, that small voice that alerts us when something is not right, urged me to be cautious. I decided to do something I had never thought of before. I searched for Elliot on social media using only the information he had given me. What I found only intensified my fear. There were no records of an Elliot with those characteristics, no photos matching the ones he used on Tinder. What I found was a forum where several women described encounters with a man who matched Elliot's profile. They talked about how he knew intimate details of their lives, as if he had accessed private information. Some mentioned feeling followed or watched. I was petrified. I decided to confront him. I sent a message, directly asking about the inconsistencies and what I had discovered. He replied almost immediately, his message cold and direct. "You shouldn't have looked into this, Evelyn. Now you know too much." At that moment, all my fears seemed to be confirmed. The suggestion of a night hike on that isolated trail was nothing less than a trap. I knew I had to act quickly. I blocked Elliot on all social media and Tinder, changed my privacy settings, and reported the incident to the police. They were cautious in their responses but promised to investigate. In the following nights, I could hardly sleep. Every shadow passing by my bedroom window made my heart race. That feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me, and I wondered if I had truly escaped from Elliot or if he was still out there, watching, waiting. But thank God nothing bad happened to me. Although the police never found any Elliot or anyone matching his description, I had never been the kind of guy who uses dating apps. I always preferred the charm of chance encounters, bumping into someone at a bookstore or a cafe. But after my last breakup, which left me more isolated than I liked, my friends insisted I needed to get back in the game. So, somewhat reluctantly, I downloaded Tinder. After swiping left and right, I matched with Sophie. She had an intriguing smile and eyes that seemed to hide 1,000 stories. Her profile was a mystery, with only a quote, "I love the suspense of night games." We decided to meet on a Friday night. She suggested the local park, a place I knew well, but that seemed like a horror movie set at night, with its long shadows and the echo of distant footsteps. She said it would be fun. "I love the thrill of danger," she typed, and I, not wanting to seem less adventurous, agreed. The park was deserted when I arrived. The only sound was my own footsteps on the fine gravel. The streetlights cast a weak golden glow, leaving pockets of darkness between them. Sophie was waiting on a bench near the entrance. She wore a black dress that blended with the night, and her smile was both welcoming and enigmatic. "Do you like chase games?" she asked after a few minutes of casual conversation. I laughed nervously, thinking it was still part of the flirtation. "Depends on the game," I replied. She took my hand, leading me through the trees, away from the lit paths. "The real fun is where the lights don't reach," she whispered. Every step we took deeper into the darkness increased my anxiety. I tried to keep the conversation going, talking about suspense movies and books, trying to understand her fascination with fear. But the atmosphere changed when she suddenly let go of my hand and vanished into the darkness without a word. I stood still, my eyes trying to adjust to the blackness surrounding me. "Sophie?" I called out, my voice sounding oddly loud in the silent park. There was no answer, just the rustle of leaves and a distant dog's bark. A cold breeze passed over me, bringing the damp smell of grass. I tried to convince myself it was just a joke, a game she might have taken too far to impress me. I decided to move forward, trying to find her. My heart was pounding as I walked, my eyes straining in the dark. Then I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned quickly, but saw no one. "Is this part of the game?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. The footsteps stopped when I stopped and resumed when I started walking. Someone was following me, playing with me, The tension grew as I moved. It was no longer about whether Sophie would appear laughing from a nearby bush. Now real fear set in. The trees seemed to close in around me, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. The idea that I was being hunted, in a dark park, by someone I couldn't see was terrifying. Suddenly, the sound of the footsteps grew louder, as if the person was now running towards me. I ran, stumbling over roots and stones, panic taking over completely. I no longer knew where I was or how far I had run. I only knew I needed to escape, needed light, people, anything to get me out of this macabre chase. I ran without looking back, feeling my breath and fear competing furiously in my chest. The darkness seemed endless, and every step forward only led me deeper into the unknown. The sound of the footsteps behind me grew louder, more urgent. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear my own labored breathing. In a blind panic, I tripped over an exposed root and fell face first onto the cold, damp ground. For a second, all I could do was lie there, trying to catch my breath, feeling the wet earth against my face. But the footsteps didn't stop. Instead, they grew closer and closer until I could almost feel my pursuer's presence. I forced myself to stand up, ignoring the pain screaming from my injured knee, and looked around frantically. There was no one in sight, but I felt the presence, felt the eyes on me. Then, out of nowhere, a figure darted past me, as swift and silent as a shadow. I screamed, more out of shock than pain, and staggered back. Then I heard a low laugh, a laugh that chilled my blood. "You're really good at this, you know?" Sophie's voice cut through the night, coming from some indistinct direction. "But the game is over now. You entertained me quite a bit." She emerged from the shadows, walking towards me with a disturbing calm. She stopped a few steps away, the smile still on her face, now illuminated by the faint light of a distant street lamp. "Sorry if I scared you," she said, her voice soft, almost melodic. "But you said you liked a bit of suspense. I just wanted to make our night a little more exciting." I was panting, my heart still racing, trying to process whether it had all really just been a game for her, or if I had narrowly escaped something far more sinister. Still trembling, I didn't know whether to laugh at the situation or scream for help. The relief of knowing I wasn't in mortal danger mingled with the anger of having been manipulated in such a cruel way. "That went too far, Sophie," I said, my voice shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. "Do you really think this is fun?" She shrugged, a light gesture that seemed out of place given the intensity of what had just happened. "Sorry, I really thought you were enjoying the adrenaline. Many guys like this kind of thing. But I understand if you don't want to see me again." I took a deep breath, looking at her one last time before turning and starting to walk back to the park entrance, towards the light and normalcy. When I got home, the solitude of my apartment had never seemed so comforting. I locked the door more firmly than necessary and promised myself I would be more careful with whom I let into my life, both virtually and in reality. I never thought that after ending a 5-year relationship, my attempt to get back into the dating game would turn into a digital horror story. Tired of the loneliness that the breakup had left me with, I decided to create a profile on Tinder. "Let's see what happens," I thought to myself as I adjusted the settings on my new profile, adding my best photos and describing my interests: suspense movies, classic literature, and morning runs. It didn't take long before I found someone interesting. She had a contagious smile in her photos, and her interests perfectly aligned with mine. Our conversation flowed so naturally that it felt like we had known each other for years. We decided to meet in person at a casual yet elegant restaurant in the city center. The place was known for its cozy atmosphere and a small selection of gourmet dishes. I was excited, thinking this might be my chance to truly start anew. The date started incredibly well. She was even more charming in person, laughing at my jokes and sharing stories from her own life. However, as the night went on, her questions started becoming more specific and invasive. First, she asked about my financial situation, a question I tried to deflect with a joke about spending more on books than I should. But she persisted, asking about investments, the security of my job, and even details about my family. The initial lightness of our meeting was replaced by a tension I could no longer ignore. Despite the strangeness that began to cloud our date, I decided not to cut ties immediately after that night. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid, overreacting to her interest, which might have been harmless. However, the following days turned my mild concerns into real alarm. I started receiving security notifications from my bank and email, alerting me to attempts to access my accounts. Someone was trying to reset my passwords. Each alert made my heart race, and my mind raced back to those invasive questions she had asked. It was impossible not to connect the dots. This woman, who had seemed so charming and interested, now appeared to be a digital predator, gathering information under the guise of a romantic date. The fear settled deep when I realized that my phone number, which I had shared with her, was now a channel for phishing attempts. Suspicious messages and calls from unknown numbers became frequent. Each vibration of my phone started to scare me, making me increasingly paranoid. I was being hunted through my own devices, the ones I used every day, that held my entire life. The situation quickly escalated into a nightmare I never imagined living. Each day brought a new scare. One day, after returning from work, I found a note on my car, which was parked in the underground garage of my building. There were no cameras, no one to see who had left it there. The note said, "We are closer than you think." That message, written carelessly and anonymously, chilled my blood. It was clear that the attempts to invade my digital accounts had spilled into my physical life. That night, I barely slept, jumping at the slightest noise. I watched the windows of my apartment, wondering if someone out there could be watching me at that very moment. The vulnerability of knowing that someone, whoever this woman was or whoever she represented, had not only my data but also the audacity to threaten me personally was terrifying. In the following days, every step outside was a test of my nerves. I started seeing shadows where there were none, distrusting any stranger who crossed my path. My world had shrunk to a constant checking of digital and physical locks, an exhaustive but necessary security routine. It felt like I was trapped in a suspense movie, except reality doesn't offer breaks, and I couldn't just wait for the credits to roll to free myself from the anxiety. After weeks of constant tension and paralyzing fear, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. With the help of a friend who works in digital security, I increased the protection measures on all my accounts and devices. I changed all my passwords to combinations that even I could barely remember, installed two-factor authentication where I hadn't before, and adopted more robust antivirus software. Of course, I also went to the police, but I found out that they don't give much attention to isolated cases like this, so I ended up relying solely on my own efforts. Since I moved to the big city, my love life hasn't exactly been thriving. University professors aren't exactly the glamorous type that many people expect. My days were consumed with long hours of preparing lectures and grading papers, and the nights were a mix of solo dinners and historical documentary marathons. So when a friend suggested I try Tinder, I thought, why not? After a few disastrous attempts and memorable dates only for the lack of connection, I was almost ready to give up on the idea. But then, amidst the swiping left and right, a profile caught my eye. She was also a literature lover, had traveled to places I only knew through books, and her smile was contagious. We decided to set up a date. The chosen spot was a well-known restaurant in the city, which always seemed like a safe and pleasant place for a first date. On the appointed night, as I waited for her, I felt a mix of nervousness and hope. Could this finally be someone with whom I could share more than just a night of forced conversations? She arrived punctually, as charming as in her photos, and the first hour of the date was better than I could have hoped. We talked about our favorite books, travel experiences that had changed our worldviews, and I started to feel genuinely optimistic about where the night might lead. As the night progressed, our conversation topics also began to shift. She brought up stories of her previous dates, which wasn't unusual, but the content was disturbing. She started with situations that seemed comical in their oddity but quickly turned darker. She talked about how one of her dates had turned into a physical fight between two men vying for her attention, narrating with an enthusiasm that made my skin crawl. Each story seemed more intense and violent than the last. Then she casually mentioned that she always carried certain safety items with her. Intrigued and a bit alarmed, I asked what kind of items she meant. Without hesitation, she opened her bag and revealed a collection of small knives and pepper spray. "You never know when you'll need to defend yourself," she said with a confident look. My unease grew exponentially. The restaurant's previously cozy and sophisticated atmosphere started to feel confining and dangerous. The tension mounted as she seemed to revel in my discomfort, detailing how powerful she felt carrying these items. The night had taken a completely unexpected turn, and the anxiety made me lose my appetite. As the conversation became increasingly uncomfortable, I decided it was time to end the date. Mentioning that I needed to wake up early the next day, I began to ask for the check. However, she didn't seem willing to let the night end there. "Are you sure you need to leave now? The night is just beginning," she insisted, with a tone that sent chills down my spine. When I insisted that I had to go, I noticed a strange glint in her eyes. She started talking about how people often underestimate the danger in everyday situations like Tinder dates. Sometimes you think you know someone, but you don't. People can be so unpredictable. Each word was laden with a threatening undertone, and I felt a real fear taking hold of me. When I finally stood up to leave, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You can't go yet. We're not done with our conversation." Her voice was low and menacing. My heart raced, and for a moment, I feared she might use one of her safety items on me. Calmly, I asked her to let go, arguing that I really needed to leave. For a moment, she stared at me, evaluating my words, and then, for reasons I couldn't understand, she relaxed her grip and let me go. I hurriedly left the restaurant, glancing back several times to make sure she wasn't following me. Back in the safety of my apartment, I locked the door with more force than necessary and promised myself I would be more careful about who I let into my life, both virtually and in reality. I've always been a social guy, but not exactly an expert in relationships. That was until I ventured into dating apps, where I met interesting people and had fun dates. After several coffees and movies with different people, I was starting to really enjoy the experience. It was in this context that I met Elena on Tinder. She had a contagious smile in her photos and a natural ability to make conversations flow easily, even over text. Elena seemed genuine and fun. For weeks, we exchanged messages about everything: music, movies, our jobs, and even our future plans. She had a light-hearted way of living that immediately attracted me. When she suggested that we finally meet, I was more than ready to see if our virtual chemistry would translate into the real world. She chose a local pub known for its cozy atmosphere and good live music, which seemed like the perfect spot for a first date. However, on the appointed day, Elena sent a message asking to change our plans. She suggested that I pick her up at her house since something had come up and she would be late if she had to go alone. Although a bit hesitant, I agreed. The idea of meeting her in person and the excitement of the date made me overlook the sudden change. I drove to the address she gave me, a residential neighborhood that I knew only superficially but seemed quiet enough during the day. Arriving in front of the indicated house, I felt a pang of nervousness. It was a more isolated area than I expected, with few houses around and almost no activity on the streets. I sent a message letting her know I had arrived, and a few minutes later, the front door opened. Elena, with a slight smile, waved for me to come in while she finished getting ready. The door closing behind me with a heavy click was the first sound that made me question whether I should be there. When the door closed behind me, an inexplicable chill ran down my spine. The house seemed eerily silent, a stark contrast to the liveliness of our conversations. Elena asked me to wait in the living room while she went to the bathroom to finish getting ready. The interior of the house was modest, with slightly worn furniture and family photos on the walls, which made the environment feel somewhat normal. However, something about the silence felt heavy, almost as if it carried a secret. Minutes dragged on, and Elena's delay started to make me anxious. I decided to look at the photos to pass the time. Among family and travel pictures, one stood out: Elena and two men who I assumed were friends or relatives. However, something about their expressions seemed severe, almost threatening. At that moment, I heard heavy footsteps coming from the hallway behind me. Before I could turn around, the light went out. Complete darkness enveloped me quickly, and two figures emerged from the shadows. They were men, the same ones from the photo, approaching with a cold determination. One of them spoke in a low, threatening voice, demanding my phone and wallet. Fear paralyzed me for a second, but adrenaline soon took over. In a reflexive move, I pushed the closest one and ran towards the door. The house, now a dark labyrinth, felt much more menacing than when I had entered. The run to the door was the longest and most terrifying of my life. Every step seemed to echo infinitely in the darkness as I heard the men's footsteps behind me, their grunts and curses increasing the tension with each second. Fear had transformed me. I was driven purely by the instinct to survive. I managed to reach the doorknob, trembling, and threw myself outside, hoping the men wouldn't follow me into the deserted street. The streetlight never seemed so comforting, and the cool night air had never felt so sweet. I ran without looking back, ran as if my life depended on it, and at that moment I really felt it did. When I finally stopped, I was several blocks away, panting and disoriented, trying to process what had happened. Shock turned to anger and then to deep sadness. I had been tricked, lured into a trap under the promise of a human connection, something that seemed increasingly rare. I called the police as soon as I felt safe, explaining in detail what had happened. The authorities acted quickly, advising me to stay where I was while a patrol car was dispatched to meet me. When the police arrived at Elena's house, they found only one of the men. He tried to resist but was detained. Elena and the other man had disappeared, leaving few clues behind. The police started an investigation but warned me that cases like this could be complicated, especially when the involved parties managed to flee and hide.